When they threatened to take everything I'd built over the last 15 years, I knew I had to make a choice, give in to their demands, or fight back. What happened next changed not just my life, but an entire community. This is a story about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. Today I'm going to share something that's never been told before, a story that started on a quiet Tuesday morning and ended up exposing a system of corruption that had been growing right under our noses. But before we get into all that, let me take you back to where it all began. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Robert Thompson, that rustic red barn behind me. I built it with my own hands. Those rolling fields stretching to the horizon, I've worked them for 15 years. This isn't just some property I bought, it's a legacy I've poured my heart and soul into. Every morning I'd wake up at 5 a.m., watch the sunrise, paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, and thank my lucky stars for this piece of heaven I called home. My grandfather always said, "A man's land is his freedom." And out here, 20 miles from the nearest town, I understood exactly what he meant. I'd built something special here. Started with just 30 acres of overlooked land that nobody wanted. The soil was poor, the fences were falling apart, and the previous owner had let it go to seed, but I saw potential. Year after year, I worked the soil, rebuilt the fences, and transformed it into one of the most productive organic farms in the county. My neighbors, scattered as they were, became like family. There was old Mr. Harrison down the road, who'd stop by with fresh honey every month. Maria Garcia to the east, whose tomatoes won the county fair 3 years running. We were a community of people who valued independence and respected each other's space. The farm wasn't just successful, it was thriving. We supplied organic produce to 5 local restaurants, had a waiting list for our CSA program, and were even featured in the regional farming magazine. Life was good, simple, and exactly how I wanted it. But you know what they say about perfect moments. They're usually right before everything changes. I just didn't expect change to come in the form of a certified letter that would turn my whole world upside down. What I'm about to share with you isn't just my story. It's a warning about what can happen when you're not paying attention to the small print, and more importantly, it's about what it takes to stand your ground when the odds are stacked against you. You see, farming isn't just about growing crops. It's about nurturing something bigger than yourself, about leaving a legacy that matters. My father taught me that the measure of a person isn't in how much they own, but in how they handle adversity. I was about to be tested in ways I never imagined. That morning started like any other. The roosters crowed at dawn, the morning dew sparkled on the grass, and the smell of fresh coffee filled my kitchen. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. I had no idea that in just a few hours, I'd be facing a battle that would test everything I believed in. The morning mail usually brought seed catalogs and farming magazines, maybe the occasional letter from my sister in Colorado. But that Thursday morning, mixed in with the usual stack, was a thick envelope that made my stomach tighten the moment I saw it. The return address read Regional Development Authority, with Marcus Wells listed as Executive Director. I remember standing there in my muddy work boots, the rest of the mail forgotten on the kitchen counter as I stared at that envelope. Something about the official seal, the weight of the paper, the precise way my name and address were printed, it all screamed trouble. Inside was a 40-page document, written in the kind of language that lawyers love and normal people hate. But the message became clear enough by the second paragraph. The Regional Development Authority had designated our entire area for what they called agricultural modernization. My land, along with every farm within a 10-mile radius, was being rezoned for high-efficiency industrial farming operations. The document went on to explain that all current landowners would need to comply with new operational standards within 90 days. These standards included minimum acreage requirements, mandatory equipment upgrades, and something called technological integration protocols. The kicker? The estimated cost of these upgrades would run into hundreds of thousands of dollars. I poured myself a cup of coffee and read through the document again, my hands shaking slightly as I turned each page. They weren't just changing the rules. They were trying to force small farmers like me out of business. The requirements were impossible for operations our size to meet. It was like demanding a corner store compete with a supermarket chain overnight. The phone started ringing almost immediately. First was Maria Garcia, her voice tight with worry. "Robert, did you get the letter? What are we going to do?" Before I could answer, another call beeped through. Mr. Harrison, then the Petersons, then half a dozen other neighbors. Everyone had received the same notice, and everyone was asking the same questions. I spent the morning trying to make sense of the legal jargon, but it was like trying to nail jelly to a wall. Every clear question I had was answered with a paragraph of bureaucratic doublespeak. The only thing that was crystal clear was the deadline. 90 days to comply, or face daily fines that would make a banker blush. Around noon, I drove out to check on my fields, hoping the familiar sight of growing things would help clear my head. The corn was coming up strong, rows of green stretching toward the horizon. These plants didn't care about zoning laws or development authorities. They just needed sun, water, and good soil, things I'd spent 15 years learning to provide. That's when I noticed the black SUV parked at the end of my driveway. A man in an expensive suit was taking photos of my property, making notes on a tablet. He looked up as I approached, and I got my first look at Marcus Wells in person. He had the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes, and a handshake that was too firm, too practiced. "Mr. Thompson," he said, as if we were old friends meeting for coffee. "I was hoping to catch you. I trust you received our notification package." He gestured at my fields with his tablet. "Beautiful property you have here. It really has. And potential." The way he said that last word made my skin crawl. I've dealt with enough predators trying to get at my chickens to recognize that look. The calculated assessment of something seen as prey. "Potential for what exactly?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "Because from where I'm standing, this land is already living up to its potential. We're producing organic crops, supporting local businesses, feeding real people in our community." Wells smiled that empty smile again. "Mr. Thompson, you have to understand, agriculture is evolving. Small farms like yours, they're charming, but they're inefficient. The future is in scale, in technology, in optimization. The Regional Development Authority has a vision for this area, and we're offering you a chance to be part of it." I looked out at my fields, at the land I'd poured my life into. "And if I don't share your vision, then you'll be in violation of the new zoning ordinances," he said smoothly. "The fines start at $5,000 per day, but it doesn't have to come to that. We have investors who would be very interested in acquiring properties like yours. You could walk away with a very reasonable settlement." The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't about agricultural modernization. It was about forcing small farmers to sell. Someone wanted our land, and they were using bureaucracy as a weapon to get it. "I need to review these documents with my lawyer," I said, trying to buy time. Wells just nodded, that practiced smile never wavering. Of course, but do keep in mind the 90-day deadline. Time has a way of slipping by." He handed me his business card, heavy cardstock, embossed letters. "Call me when you're ready to discuss terms." I watched him drive away, gravel crunching under expensive tires. The business card felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket. Back in my kitchen, I spread out the documents again, this time reading between the lines. Every paragraph about modernization was really about consolidation. Every mention of efficiency standards was a trap designed to push us into selling. The sun was setting by the time I finished my third read-through. My phone had 27 missed calls, neighbors, fellow farmers, all probably as worried as I was. But before I returned any of them, I needed to make one call of my own. I pulled out my old address book and flipped to the section marked L. Oh, James Lawrence had been my father's lawyer back when we were fighting the bank to keep the farm during the drought of '95. He was semi-retired now, but he knew more about agricultural law than any 3 lawyers put together. If anyone could help me make sense of this mess, it was him. As I dialed his number, I looked out my kitchen window at the fields turning golden in the sunset. Marcus Wells and his development authority might have money and power on their side, but I had something they couldn't buy, a connection to this land that went bone deep. They wanted a fight? Well, they were about to get one. The phone rang. 3 times before James picked up. "Bobby Thompson," he said, his voice gravelly with age but sharp as ever. "I was wondering when you'd call. Guess you got one of those letters too." "Sure did, James. And I think I'm going to need your help."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Son, from what I've seen of these documents, we're all going to need help. Come by my office tomorrow morning. And Bobby, bring coffee, strong coffee. We've got a long fight ahead of us." I hung up the phone and walked out onto my porch. The evening air was thick with the smell of fresh-turned earth and growing things. Somewhere in the distance, a whip-poor-will called. This was what they wanted to take away. Not just land, but a way of life. Well, they were about to learn that some things aren't for sale, no matter how much pressure you apply. Tomorrow would be about lawyers and legal strategies, but tonight I had crops to tend to, because no matter what battles lay ahead, the land still needed caring for, and as long as I had breath in my body, that's exactly what I was going to do. The waiting room of the Regional Development Authority's office felt like it was designed to make people uncomfortable. Everything was chrome and glass, with chairs just slightly too low and lighting just slightly too bright. I'd been sitting there for 45 minutes, watching people in expensive suits hurry past, none of them making eye contact. Diana Foster's office was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd made a career out of reshaping communities to fit corporate blueprints. The view from her 20th floor window overlooked the city like a hawk surveying its hunting ground. Every surface gleamed with the kind of pristine cleanliness that speaks of other people's labor. "Mr. Thompson," she said, not bothering to stand as I entered, "please have a seat." Her voice carried that particular tone of someone used to being obeyed without question. She was probably in her 50s, but her face had that ageless quality that comes from expensive skincare and regular meetings with high-end cosmetic surgeons. I sat down, feeling distinctly out of place in my clean but well-worn clothes. The leather chair squeaked under my weight, and I noticed a slight tightening around Foster's eyes at the sound. She waited, clearly expecting me to speak first, to explain why I'd requested this meeting. I stayed silent, meeting her gaze steadily. After 30 seconds that felt like an hour, she sighed and picked up a tablet from her immaculate desk. "I have your file here, Mr. Thompson. 300 acres of what you call traditional farming. No automated systems, no data-driven crop management, minimal technological integration. Tell me, are you aware that your methods are achieving only 20% of the potential yield for land of that size?" "Interesting math," I replied, keeping my voice level. "Because according to the County Agricultural Board, my farm produces some of the highest quality organic crops in the region. Our yields are actually above average for sustainable farming practices." Foster's perfectly manicured fingers tapped, against her desk. Organic farming is a boutique market, Mr. Thompson. The future of agriculture lies in scale, in efficiency, in technological innovation. The Regional Development Authority has a responsibility to ensure that agricultural land is being utilized to its maximum potential. And who decides what maximum potential means? I asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're trying to force small farmers out to make way for corporate agriculture. Her smile remained fixed, but something cold flickered in her eyes. We're not forcing anyone out, Mr. Thompson. We're offering opportunities. The modernization requirements can be met through partnerships with approved agricultural corporations. Several of your neighbors have already expressed interest in these arrangements. I leaned forward slightly. You mean they're scared? You've threatened their livelihoods with impossible requirements and daily fines, and now you're offering them a chance to sell out as the only way to avoid bankruptcy. That's a rather dramatic interpretation, Foster said, her tone dismissive. We're simply updating zoning requirements to reflect modern agricultural needs. Change is inevitable, Mr. Thompson. The question is whether you'll adapt or be left behind. The question, I countered, is whether you have the legal authority to retroactively impose these requirements on established farms. My lawyer has some interesting thoughts on that subject. For the first time, I saw her composure crack slightly. Legal challenges would be unfortunate. They tend to be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately futile. The Regional Development Authority has considerable resources at its disposal. So do I said quietly. They're just different kinds of resources: community, history, truth. You might be surprised how far those can go. Foster's smile vanished entirely. Mr. Thompson, let me be clear. This modernization project will proceed. The only variable is whether you'll benefit from it or be ruined by it. I'm offering you a chance to be on the right side of progress. I stood up slowly. Progress isn't always about bigger, faster, or more profitable. Sometimes it's about protecting what matters. You want to talk about maximum potential? How about the potential of local farms to feed communities, to maintain soil health, to preserve agricultural diversity? Those are admirable sentiments, Foster said, her tone suggesting they were anything but. But sentiment doesn't drive economic growth. The reality is, small farms like yours are obsolete. You can either join us in the future or be consumed by it. Here's another reality, I replied. You might have money and political connections on your side, but you've made a serious mistake. You've threatened people's homes, their livelihoods, their way of life. That kind of threat has a way of bringing people together. Foster stood, smoothing her already perfect blazer. Is that a threat, Mr. Thompson? No, Miss Foster. It's a promise. You're not just fighting me. You're fighting every farmer, every family, every community member who believes that there's more to agriculture than corporate profits. And we're not going to back down. Then I look forward to seeing how this plays out, she said, reaching for her phone in a clear dismissal. Do give my regards to your lawyer. I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot of each other in the coming months. As I walked out of her office, I could feel her watching me. The pristine hallway seemed longer on the way out, the fluorescent lights harder on the eyes, but my steps were steady. The meeting had confirmed what I'd suspected. This wasn't just about modernization or efficiency. It was about power, about control, about replacing independent farmers with corporate agriculture. In the elevator, I pulled out my phone and sent a quick message to James Lawrence. Meeting done. They're not backing down. Time for Plan B. His response came before I reached the lobby. Good. They showed their hand. Now we show ours. Outside, the city streets were busy with lunch hour traffic. I stood for a moment, letting the sun warm my face, thinking about my fields waiting at home. Diana Foster and her corporate vision of agriculture might think small farms were obsolete, but they didn't understand what they were really fighting against. You can't quantify the value of knowledge passed down through generations. You can't put a price tag on the relationship between a farmer and their land, and you certainly can't measure the strength of a community united against injustice. The battle lines were drawn now. Foster had made it clear that there would be no easy resolution, no simple compromise. But that was fine. Some things are worth fighting for, no matter the odds. And as I drove home, watching the city's glass, towers give way to open fields and familiar farms, I knew this was going to be one of those fights. The war for the future of farming had begun. And despite Foster's threats and corporate backing, I couldn't help but smile. Because she had revealed something crucial in that meeting, beneath all their power and confidence, they were afraid. Afraid of farmers who wouldn't be bullied. Afraid of communities that couldn't be bought. Afraid of people who still believed in something bigger than profit margins and corporate spreadsheets. And that fear, that was going to be their undoing. The morning sun hadn't yet burned through the fog when I spotted the silver Lexus creeping down my driveway. Rachel Bennett from the Regional Development Authority's Compliance Division stepped out, her heels sinking slightly into the soft earth. She carried a tablet in one hand and what looked like a professional camera in the other, her expression suggesting she'd just smelled something unpleasant. "Your irrigation system is severely outdated," she announced without preamble, gesturing toward my fields. "Our satellites show inconsistent water distribution patterns. This represents a violation of Section 7(3) of the new agricultural efficiency standards." I continued loading feed into the back of my truck, deliberately taking my time. "Satellites. You're monitoring my farm from space now. The Regional Development Authority utilizes all available technologies to ensure compliance," she replied, tapping away at her tablet. "Your current system wastes approximately 30% more water than our approved methods. That's another $5,000 fine." I set down the feed bag and turned to face her fully. "Those wasteful methods have kept this soil healthy for 15 years. Your approved systems would drain the aquifer dry within a decade." Rachel's perfectly penciled eyebrows arched. "I assure you, our methods are thoroughly tested. Now about your equipment storage." She started walking toward my barn, her designer outfit completely at odds with the working farm environment. "That's private property," I called after her. "You don't have permission to conduct an inspection." She paused, turning back with a tight smile. "Under Section 12(1) of the Regional Agricultural Management Act, we have full authority to inspect any agricultural property for compliance violations. Your continued resistance is being noted." The next hour was a meticulous cataloging of everything she deemed substandard. My traditional grain storage methods were unhygienic. The heritage seed varieties I'd spent years developing were non-approved cultivars. Even the old oak tree that provided shade for my cattle was labeled a non-optimized use of agricultural space. Timothy Clark, her assistant, followed behind with a camera, documenting each alleged violation. Every click of the shutter felt like another nail in a coffin they were building for small farms like mine. "Your total fines now stand at $27,000, Rachel announced, reviewing her tablet. "However, we're prepared to waive these penalties if you agree to implement our approved modernization plan." I picked up another feed bag, mostly to keep my hands busy and resist the urge to grab that tablet and toss it into the nearest mud puddle. And this modernization plan, would that happen to involve selling my land to one of your corporate partners? Consolidated agricultural management is the future, Mr. Thompson. Fighting progress only hurts yourself. She handed me a thick envelope. "These are the violation notices, along with information about our approved modernization partners. I suggest you review them carefully." As she walked back to her car, her heels now caked with mud, She paused. "Oh, and we'll be conducting random inspections to monitor your compliance progress. Have a pleasant day." The envelope felt heavy in my hands, weighted with threats disguised as regulations. Inside were dozens of pages detailing every way my farm failed to meet their artificially imposed standards, but mixed in with the violations were glossy brochures from agricultural corporations, each offering to solve my problems by taking control of my land. That afternoon, more visitors arrived. A team of surveyors from the Regional Development Authority, wearing safety vests and carrying high-tech equipment, began taking measurements along my property lines. When I questioned their presence, they produced permits I'd never authorized. "Standard procedure for modernization assessment," the lead surveyor explained, not bothering to look up from his instruments. "We're documenting baseline topography for potential redevelopment." Potential redevelopment. The words hit like a physical blow. They weren't just planning to change how I farmed, they were already mapping out how they'd transform my land once they forced me out. The day wasn't over yet. As the surveyors packed up their equipment, a drone buzzed overhead, its camera clearly focused on my property. Then came the phone calls, representatives from various agricultural corporations, each one mysteriously aware of my compliance issues and eager to offer solutions that involved signing over control of my farm. By sunset, my kitchen table was covered with violation notices, corporate proposals, and threatening letters. Each document was another strand in the web they were weaving around small farmers like me. They were trying to make it impossible to continue operating independently, using bureaucracy as a weapon to force us into submission. I was in the middle of reviewing the latest batch of fines when my phone rang. It was Maria Garcia, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "Robert, they're saying our organic certification isn't valid anymore. Something about new soil testing requirements. They're trying to stop us from selling at the farmers market." Similar calls came in throughout the evening. Every farmer in the area was being hit with violations, each one carefully crafted to make independent operation increasingly difficult. It was death by 1,000 cuts, and they were just getting started. Around midnight, unable to sleep, I walked out to my fields. The moon was full, casting everything in silver light. This land had been in my family for generations. Every furrow, every fence line, every tree had a story. And now some corporate bureaucrats thought they could erase all that with paperwork and penalties. My phone buzzed with a text from James Lawrence. "They're moving faster than we expected. Meeting tomorrow, your place, 7 a.m. Bring everyone." I texted back a quick confirmation, then stood there a while longer, listening to the night sounds of my farm, the gentle lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through corn stalks, the distant call of a whippoorwill. These were the things Rachel Bennett and her satellites couldn't measure, the values their efficiency metrics couldn't quantify. Walking back to the house, I noticed fresh tire tracks near my storage shed. Someone had been on my property after dark. Another inspection, more surveillance. It didn't matter. They could watch all they wanted. Tomorrow, we'd start pushing back. Inside, I cleared the kitchen table of violation notices and started making lists. Names of farmers, community leaders, local business owners who depended on small farms. We'd need everyone for what was coming, because this wasn't just about agricultural regulations anymore. It was about the soul of our community. The Regional Development Authority thought they could break us down individually, overwhelm us with fines and regulations until we gave up. But they'd made a crucial mistake. Every inspection, every violation, every threat just proved what we'd suspected. All along, this was never about modernization or efficiency. It was about control. Well, they were about to learn something about control. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a fight they never saw coming. Because while they had money and political power, we had something stronger: the determination. of people protecting their way of life. I finally went to bed around 2 in the morning, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept turning over possibilities, strategies, ways to fight back against the pressure they were applying. One thing was certain: Rachel Bennett's next inspection was going to go very differently. The time for passive resistance was over. The law office of Grace Martinez wasn't what I expected. Instead of downtown glass and chrome, it occupied an old converted farmhouse on the outskirts of the city. The waiting room had mismatched furniture that looked like it came from local estate sales, and the walls were covered with newspaper clippings about environmental victories and small farm preservation cases. Grace herself matched her office, practical, unpretentious, and radiating a quiet kind of strength. Her silver hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and she wore jeans under her blazer. The desk between us was scarred oak, probably older than both of us combined. So they're using satellite surveillance to justify their violations, she said, spreading out the documents I'd brought. That's new. Usually they stick to ground-level harassment until they've softened up their targets. Her voice carried the slight twang of someone who'd grown up on a farm herself. Oliver Chen, her legal partner, sat in the corner, methodically, taking notes on a laptop that had seen better days. He was younger, probably fresh out of law school, but his eyes had the sharp focus of someone who caught details others missed. The satellite thing threw me too, I admitted. Seems like overkill. For monitoring irrigation patterns. It's not about irrigation, Oliver said, not looking up from his screen. They're building a paper trail. Every violation they document becomes ammunition in court. But they made some interesting mistakes with these notices. Grace nodded, pulling out specific pages from the stack. Look at these dates. They're citing violations of regulations that technically weren't in effect when the inspections were conducted. Sloppy work. They're usually more careful than this. They're moving faster than usual, Oliver added. Typically, these corporate land grabs play out over years. They're trying to compress their timeline. Question is, why? I leaned forward, studying the documents spread across the desk. Could it have something to do with the water rights? There's been talk about the aquifer management changing hands. Grace's eyes narrowed. She pulled out her phone and made a quick call. Kate? Yeah, it's Grace. Can you pull the recent water board meeting minutes? Last 3 months. Thanks. She turned back to me. You might be onto something. The Regional Development Authority doesn't usually care about water rights unless they're planning major development, Oliver finished. Agricultural water rights are different from residential or industrial. If they're trying to change land use designation. Grace's phone buzzed. She read the message and her expression hardened. Well, looks like our friends at the RDA have been busy. 3 members of the water board resigned last month. Their replacements all have ties to Midwest Agricultural Ventures. The same company that's been sending me buyout offers, I said, the pieces starting to click into place. Oliver was typing rapidly now. Midwest Agricultural Ventures. Parent company is Global Resource Management. They've been involved in similar situations in other states. Buy up farmland, change the water rights, then flip the property for industrial development. But they need control of enough continuous acreage to make it worth their while, Grace mused. That's why they're pushing so hard, trying to pressure everyone at once. They can't risk word getting out about their real plans. I thought about my neighbors, each facing their own barrage of violations and pressure. So what do? They've got unlimited resources, political connections. They've got money and influence, Grace corrected. We've got something better, proof of their illegal tactics. These premature violations, the unauthorized surveys, the water board manipulation, it's all documentable. Not to mention the civil rights violations, Oliver added. Warrantless surveillance, abuse of inspection authority, attempted property, seizure through bureaucratic coercion. Grace started sorting documents into piles. First, we filed for an emergency injunction to halt their inspection program. That gives us breathing room. Then we start deposing everyone involved, starting with Rachel Bennett and working our way up. They'll fight back hard, I warned. Count on it, Grace agreed. But here's what they don't understand about farming communities. We know how to dig in for the long haul. Oliver, start the injunction paperwork. Mr. Thompson, we need to gather statements from your neighbors. Every interaction with the RDA, every threat, every violation notice. Document everything. The next few hours were a crash course in agricultural law and corporate manipulation tactics. Grace and Oliver walked me through similar cases showing how other communities had fought back against corporate land grabs. Some had won, some had lost, but each story added to our understanding of what we were up against. The key, Grace explained, is to shift from defense to offense. Right now, they've got you all reacting to their moves. We need to make them react to ours. Oliver looked up from his laptop. The waterboard angle might be our best shot, if we can prove they manipulated the board appointments to facilitate their development plans. That's federal territory, Grace nodded. Environmental Protection Agency would be very interested in that kind of manipulation of water resources. A knock at the door interrupted us. Kate, Grace's assistant, entered with a stack of files. "You're going to want to see this," she said, handing them to Grace. "Found some interesting connections between the Regional Development Authority and certain city council members." Grace flipped through the files, her expression growing grimmer with each page. Campaign contributions, consulting contracts, property deals. They've been laying the groundwork for this for years. But they got sloppy, Oliver pointed out. The timeline compression forced them to cut corners. Classic corporate mistake, sacrificing careful planning for quick results. I studied the web of connections laid out in the files. Shell companies, hidden ownership arrangements, carefully disguised money trails, all leading back to the same goal, forcing small farmers off their land. We need to move fast, Grace decided. Oliver, finish the injunction filing tonight. I'll start calling other affected farmers. We need signed statements by tomorrow. Mr. Thompson, go home and document everything. Every interaction, every piece of correspondence, every suspicious vehicle near your property. Details matter. As I stood to leave, Grace added, "And Mr. Thompson, tell your neighbors to start taking photos of those survey teams and drones. We're going to need evidence of every unauthorized inspection." Walking back to my truck, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. We weren't just blindly resisting anymore. We had a plan, we had experts on our side, and most importantly, we had proof of their illegal tactics. Grace's voice followed me out. "Remember, they're counting on you feeling isolated and overwhelmed, but you're not alone in this fight. Not anymore." The drive home gave me time to think. The Regional Development Authority had picked this fight, thinking they were targeting scattered, vulnerable farmers who would fold under pressure. Instead, they'd started a war they weren't prepared to fight. Because while they had money and political connections, we had something stronger: the truth about their plans and the determination to expose it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pressures, new attempts to break our resolve. But tonight, for the first time since this started, I knew we had a fighting chance. They wanted a battle over the future of farming in our community. Well, they were about to get one they'd never forget. The Regional Development Authority's emergency board meeting wasn't open to the public, but that didn't stop 50 farmers from showing up anyway. We stood in the marble-floored lobby of their downtown headquarters, our work boots and mud-stained jeans a stark contrast to the pristine corporate environment. Nathan Hughes, the authority's executive director, emerged from the elevator bank like a storm cloud in an expensive suit. His security detail moved to clear a path through our group, but he waved them off, plastering on a practiced smile that wouldn't have fooled a child. "Gentlemen, ladies," he addressed us, his voice carrying the polished tone of countless press conferences. While I appreciate your interest in our proceedings, this is a closed session. Perhaps we could schedule a community forum for next month to address your concerns. Next month? Maria Garcia stepped forward, her normally gentle voice sharp with anger. After you've already filed liens against our properties, after you've destroyed our organic certifications with your unauthorized soil testing? Hughes's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. Mrs. Garcia, I assure you the Regional Development Authority is following all proper procedures. If you're experiencing certification issues, I'm sure our Agricultural Compliance Office can assist. Your Compliance Office is the problem, another farmer called out. You're making up regulations to force us out. The lobby's security cameras swiveled to track our group. More guards appeared near the exits, trying to look casual and failing. Hughes raised his hands in a placating gesture that only fueled the tension. I understand change can be difficult, he began, his tone dripping with condescension. But the modernization of agricultural practices is inevitable. The Regional Development Authority is simply trying to ensure our community keeps pace with progress. I stepped forward, meeting his gaze directly. Progress? Is that what you call secretly stacking the waterboard with corporate puppets? Is that what you call using satellite surveillance to harass farmers who won't sell? For just a moment, Hughes's mask slipped. Surprise and anger flashed across his face before he recovered his composure. Mr. Thompson, I presume. I've heard quite a bit about you. Perhaps we should continue this discussion in private. Nothing to hide, right? I countered. Since you're so committed to progress and proper procedures, his smile turned predatory. Very well, my office. Now, the rest of you will need to leave before I'm forced to have security escort you out. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent and tense. Hughes stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring straight ahead, while his security detail watched me like I might try to hijack the building. His office suite was larger than my entire farmhouse, with floor-to-ceiling, windows offering a panoramic view of the city and the farmland beyond. He took his time settling behind his massive desk, arranging himself like a king holding court. You're becoming quite a nuisance, Mr. Thompson, he said finally. These dramatic displays, these baseless accusations, they're not helping your situation. Baseless? I pulled out my phone and played a recording. Rachel Bennett's voice filled the room, detailing their plans to manipulate water rights and force land sales. Hughes's face darkened as he listened. Where did you get that? Does it matter? There's more. Documents about your waterboard manipulation, evidence of illegal surveillance, records of your connections to Midwest agricultural ventures. Want me to keep going? He leaned back, studying me with new calculation in his eyes. What do you want? I want you to back off. Cancel the fraudulent violations. Leave our farms alone. A harsh laugh escaped him. You really don't understand what you're involved in, do you? This isn't some small-town operation you can derail with amateur detective work. We have investors waiting, contracts signed, developments planned. The agricultural modernization program will proceed. Not if the EPA finds out about your water rights manipulation, I countered. Not if the state attorney general sees evidence of your corporate kickback schemes. Threats, Mr. Thompson. That's a dangerous game. He pressed a button on his desk phone. Susan, please pull up all the violation records for Mr. Thompson's property. Every inspection, every drone survey, every satellite scan. His secretary's voice crackled through the speaker. Sir, those files, they're not accessible. The system's showing some kind of error. Hughes frowned. What do you mean not accessible? They're just gone. All the satellite data, the inspection, reports, everything. I couldn't help smiling. Having technical difficulties. his face flushed with anger. "What did you do?" "Me? Nothing. But it turns out your system security isn't as robust as you thought. Amazing what a few skilled IT professionals can do when they're motivated by watching their parents' farms being threatened." Hughes stood abruptly, looming over his desk. "You think erasing some files will stop us? We'll just conduct new inspections, gather new evidence. You can't fight progress, Thompson. The small family farm is dead. The sooner you accept that, the better off you'll be." "That's where you're wrong," I said, standing to match him. "The small farm isn't dead. It's evolving, adapting, finding new ways to feed communities and preserve land. Your kind of progress, the kind that destroys communities for corporate profit, that's what's dying." "Charming sentiment," he sneered. "Let's see how long you maintain it when your bank accounts are drained by fines and legal fees." "This isn't just about your farm anymore, Thompson. You've made it personal. We're going to bury you in paperwork, drown you in violations, and when we're done, we'll still get your land. And I'll personally ensure it's the first plot developed." Careful, Nathan," I said quietly. "You're starting to sound like someone abusing their authority for personal vengeance. I wonder how that would play in front of a grand jury." His face went perfectly still. For a long moment, we stared at each other across the desk, the magnitude of our conflict filling the air between us. Finally, he sat back down, straightening his tie with deliberate precision. "Get out of my office, Mr. Thompson. The next time we speak will be through lawyers." "Looking forward to it," I replied. "Oh, and Nathan, you might want to check your personal email. Someone may have sent some interesting documents to your board of directors. You know, the ones showing your private deals with developers. Might make for an interesting emergency board meeting." I left him there, his face ashen, and walked out past his speechless security detail. In the lobby, my fellow farmers were still waiting, tension evident in their stance. "Well?" Maria asked as I emerged. "They're not backing down," I told her, "but neither are we. And now we know something important. They're scared. Scared enough to make mistakes. Scared enough to show their true colors." The security guards were starting to move toward our group with more purpose now. As we walked out into the afternoon sun, I couldn't help feeling that a line had been crossed. The gloves were off now. Nathan Hughes had shown exactly what kind of man he was and exactly how far he would go to get what he wanted. But he'd also shown us something else, the weakness in his armor, his pride, his arrogance, his absolute certainty that he could bulldoze anyone in his path. Those would be his undoing. The fight for our farms had just entered a new phase, and there would be no going back. But as I looked at the determined faces of my fellow farmers, I knew we were ready for whatever came. Next, sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what you're really fighting for. The email arrived at 3 in the morning, its timestamp suggesting the sender had been working late into the night. Emily Wilson, Senior Environmental Compliance Officer for the state, had a reputation for being thorough. The contents of her message proved why. "Mr. Thompson, after reviewing the documentation you provided, I found significant irregularities in the Regional Development Authority's water quality reports. My team needs to conduct an immediate inspection of the affected properties. This situation may be more serious than initially suspected." I read the email 3 times, my coffee growing cold beside me. Emily's official position gave her the authority to override local development decisions if environmental violations were found. This could be the break we'd been waiting for. By sunrise, a fleet of state vehicles was parked along my driveway. Emily Wilson stood out from her team, her practical field gear contrasting with their office attire. She moved with the efficiency of someone who'd spent more time in the field than behind a desk. "Show me the test sites first," she said, consulting her tablet. "The soil samples the RDA used to justify their violations. I want to see exactly where they were taken." We walked the property, Emily documenting everything with photographs and detailed notes, Her frown deepened as we reached the spot where Rachel Bennett's team had conducted their tests. "This is wrong," she muttered, kneeling to examine the soil. Their reports claim they found chemical contamination requiring immediate remediation. But look at this soil structure, the organic content. She pulled out testing equipment, her movements precise and practiced. Alexander Morris, the RDA's newly appointed environmental liaison, chose that moment to appear. He strode across the field, his polished shoes inappropriate for the muddy terrain. "This is an unauthorized inspection," he announced, waving a document. "The Regional Development Authority has exclusive jurisdiction over agricultural environmental assessments in this area." Emily stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. "Mr. Morris, I presume. Interesting timing. I was just about to call your office about these soil test results." "Those results are proprietary RDA data," he snapped. "You have no authority to question them." "Actually," Emily replied, her voice carrying the weight of state authority, "fraudulent environmental testing falls directly under my jurisdiction. Care to explain why your team reported toxic contamination in soil that shows no signs of chemical alteration?" Morris's face reddened. "Our testing protocols are proprietary." "Your testing protocols are fabricated," Emily cut in, "just like your water quality reports. Just like your remediation requirements. The question is why? Why falsify environmental data to force small farms into violation?" The confrontation drew the attention of Emily's team. They gathered around, recording devices active, as Morris began to sweat despite the cool morning air. "You're making serious accusations without proper context," he blustered. "The Regional Development Authority follows all required procedures." "Required procedures like falsifying state-mandated environmental reports." Emily pulled out a tablet, displaying documents. "These are your original test results, Mr. Morris, before they were altered. Want to explain the discrepancies?" Morris took a step back, his composure cracking. "Those are internal documents. How did you—" "Someone in your organization has a conscience," Emily said quietly. "They provided quite an interesting paper trail, altered test results, backdated reports, manipulated data, all designed to create false violations. This is a criminal matter now," she continued, gesturing to her team. "We'll need all your testing records, all communication about these properties, everything. And Mr. Morris, I suggest you contact a lawyer." Morris turned and practically ran to his car, phone already pressed to his ear. As he peeled out of the driveway, Emily turned to me with a grim smile. "They've been sloppy," she said. "Arrogant. They never expected anyone to check their data this closely. My team will need access to all the affected properties. We're going to document everything." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. State investigators spread out across neighboring farms, collecting samples, taking photographs, gathering evidence. Every test result further exposed the RDA's deception. Victoria Lee, our county agricultural extension agent, arrived mid-morning. She'd been suspicious of the RDA's claims from the start, but lacked the authority to challenge them. Now, working with Emily's team, she began documenting the true state of our farming practices. "Your soil health metrics are exceptional," she told me, reviewing test results. "Organic matter content, microbial activity, water retention, everything. The RDA claimed was substandard is actually well above average. They didn't just lie about violations, they actively covered up evidence of successful, sustainable farming practices." Peter Wright from the RDA appeared around noon, attempting to serve cease and desist orders to Emily's team. She calmly handed him a state executive order authorizing her investigation and suggested he add obstruction of justice to his growing list of concerns. By late afternoon, the scale of the RDA's deception was becoming clear. They hadn't just falsified a few test results. They'd created an elaborate fiction designed to force farmers off their land. Every violation, every fine, every threat had been based on manufactured evidence. Emily called her superior in the state capital, speaking in the clipped tones of someone delivering urgent news. "Sir, we're looking at systematic a fraud. The Regional Development Authority has been falsifying test results to create artificial violations. Yes, sir. Criminal charges will be appropriate. We'll need the Attorney General's office involved." As the sun began to set, Emily gathered a team for a final briefing. State police had arrived to secure records at the RDA office. Morris and several other officials had been called in for questioning. The House of Cards was beginning to collapse. "Mr. Thompson," Emily said, as her team packed up their equipment, "what you've exposed here goes beyond local corruption. This is organized environmental fraud on a massive scale. The RDA wasn't just trying to force out small farmers. They were covering up their own violations while doing it." She handed me a preliminary report, its pages filled with technical data and damning conclusions. "Keep this safe. There are people who will want this buried. But with this evidence plus the whistleblower's documentation, they can't sweep this under the rug." As the state vehicles pulled away, their taillights disappearing into the gathering dusk, I stood in my field thinking about the magnitude of what had just happened. The RDA's carefully constructed plan had depended on their environmental claims going unchallenged. They never expected someone like Emily Wilson to look too closely at their data. The night air carried the scent of fresh earth and growing things, smells that had nothing to do with the RDA's falsified reports and everything to do with generations of careful stewardship. They had tried to destroy our farms using lies about environmental damage. Instead, they had exposed their own corruption. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The RDA wouldn't go down without a fight. But tonight, standing in the fields they had tried to steal, I felt the tide beginning to turn. Sometimes the biggest victories come not from confrontation, but from simply exposing the truth for all to see. Detective James Anderson wasn't what I expected from a white-collar crimes investigator. His weathered face and calloused hands spoke of someone more comfortable in the field than behind a desk. He spent the first hour just walking my property, taking in every detail with eyes that missed nothing. "Environmental fraud usually leaves a paper trail," he said, reviewing the documents spread across my kitchen table. "But this is different. The Regional Development Authority didn't just falsify reports. They created an entire fictional narrative about environmental degradation. That takes coordination, planning, multiple levels of involvement." Laura Mitchell, his forensic accountant, sat nearby, her fingers flying over her laptop keyboard as she dug through financial records. "The money trail is fascinating," she said, not looking up. "They've been moving funds through a series of shell companies, all supposedly for environmental remediation projects that never existed." "Classic misdirection," Anderson nodded. "Make it look like they're investing in environmental protection while actually funding their development plans. But they got sloppy with the details." Ryan Phillips, the technical analyst, pulled up satellite imagery on his tablet. "Look at these scan patterns." He pointed to a series of grid lines overlaying my farm. They weren't just gathering data, they were mapping development zones. Each environmental violation corresponds to a planned construction site. Hannah Baker from the Evidence Collection Unit carefully photographed and catalogued every document, every email, every piece of correspondence from the RDA. "We need to establish a clear chain of evidence," she explained. "When this goes to court, they'll try to challenge the authenticity of everything." Anderson moved to the window, studying the RDA survey markers that still dotted my fields. "They were so confident in their plan that they didn't bother hiding their intentions. Those aren't agricultural survey markers. They're construction plot indicators. They were literally mapping out their development before they even had control of the land. The day progressed with methodical precision. Anderson's team worked like a well-oiled machine, each person focusing on their specialty while building a comprehensive case. They interviewed neighboring farmers, documented altered test sites, and tracked the web of connections between the RDA and various development companies. "The pattern is clear," Anderson said during a brief break. "They target agricultural areas, manufacture environmental violations, force out small farmers through impossible fines, then swoop in with their development plans. They've done this before, but never on this scale." Laura looked up from her computer, found something interesting in their tax records. The RDA has been claiming massive environmental remediation expenses for properties they don't even control yet. They're not just planning ahead, they're committing tax fraud. Ryan added another layer to his digital map. The development plans are massive. Industrial parks, luxury housing, retail complexes. They're planning to transform the entire agricultural district. The environmental violations were just the first step. Hannah carefully sealed another evidence bag. The level of detail in their planning is extraordinary. They have marketing materials already prepared, construction contracts ready to sign. They never doubted their ability to force everyone out. As the sun began to set, Anderson gathered his team for a final briefing. "Tomorrow we'll start serving warrants. Every RDA office, every connected business, every location where they might have stored records. They'll try to destroy evidence once they realize we're moving, so we hit everything simultaneously." He turned to me. "Mr. Thompson, what you've exposed here, it's bigger than just protecting your farm. This is systematic corruption targeting agricultural communities across the state. The RDA thought they could hide behind environmental regulations, but they left too many traces." Laura closed her laptop. "The financial implications alone are staggering. When this breaks, it's going to trigger investigations into similar operations nationwide." Ryan saved his digital evidence to secure drives. "The technical evidence is solid. Their own data proves they fabricated environmental concerns to justify their actions." Hannah finished organizing her evidence logs. Every document, every photo, every piece of physical evidence has been properly cataloged and secured. They can't claim contamination of evidence. Anderson's phone buzzed with a message. His expression turned grim as he read it. "They know we're building a case. Someone at the RDA just initiated emergency document destruction. Protocols at their main office." The team sprang into action. Within minutes, they were mobilizing additional units to secure RDA facilities. The careful gathering of evidence was about to become a race against time. "Stay alert," Anderson warned as his team prepared to leave. "The RDA is going to realize their entire operation is at risk. People who've committed fraud on this scale, they don't go down quietly." I watched the investigators drive away, their headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. The quiet of my farm felt different now, not peaceful, but charged with anticipation. Tomorrow would bring search warrants, evidence seizures, and the beginning of the RDA's downfall. Inside, I reviewed copies of the evidence logs Hannah had prepared. Each entry represented another piece of the RDA's deception, another link in the chain of corruption they'd tried to hide behind environmental concerns. They had thought their plan was perfect: use environmental regulations as a weapon, force out small farmers and transform agricultural land into profitable development. But they had underestimated the power of truth, the determination of farmers fighting for their land, and the methodical persistence of investigators like James Anderson. Their elaborate scheme was about to unravel, exposed by the very attention to detail they thought would protect them. Tomorrow would bring chaos as the investigation went public. The RDA would fight back with lawyers, media spin, and desperate attempts to destroy evidence. But tonight, in the quiet of my farm, I knew we had finally turned the tide. Sometimes the best strategy isn't fighting force with force, but simply shining a light on the truth and letting justice take its course. Midnight brought an unexpected visitor to my farm. Daniel Reynolds, the Regional Development Authority's Chief Financial Officer, arrived in a black luxury sedan, his usual polished appearance showing signs of strain. The security cameras caught him pacing near my front gate for almost 10 minutes before he finally pressed the intercom button. Through the camera feed, I could see he was alone, his expensive suit wrinkled, his tie loosened. This wasn't the confident executive who'd signed off on countless violation notices. This was a man at his breaking point. Isabella King, the state investigator assigned to monitor my property, watched the feed with narrowed eyes. This is unusual. Senior executives don't make midnight visits unless something's wrong. Very wrong. The intercom crackled. Thompson, I know you're in there. We need to talk. It's about the environmental reports. There's something you need to know. Isabella keyed her radio, alerting the surveillance team parked down the road. Target on sight. Maintain positions, but be ready to move. I opened the front door, staying within the frame where the cameras could capture everything. Reynolds stood in the darkness beyond my porch light's reach, his face half hidden in shadow. Kind of late for a social call, I said, making no move to invite him closer. He stepped forward, then stopped abruptly as security lights activated, flooding the area with harsh brightness. This isn't what you think. The environmental violations, the water quality reports. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Lucas Gray, our digital forensics expert, quietly adjusted the camera feeds, ensuring every angle was covered. Everything's recording, audio and video crystal clear. Reynolds ran a hand through his disheveled hair. Look, there are things happening that you don't understand. The development plans, the corporate partnerships. It's bigger than just your farms. Why don't you come explain it then? I gestured to my porch. Tell me what I don't understand. He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at the empty driveway. I can't be seen here. But you need to know. Tomorrow morning, the RDA is going to announce a major technological initiative. Smart farming integration, automated systems, corporate partnerships. They're going to paint anyone who resists as backwards, anti-progress. Samantha White, our legal observer, was transcribing every word. He's giving us their playbook, she whispered. Keep him talking. And the environmental violations. I asked. The falsified test results? Reynolds stepped closer, his voice dropping. Insurance. We needed leverage to force compliance. The development plans required complete participation. No holdouts. The environmental angle was convenient. Convenient? My voice hardened. You destroyed people's livelihoods with fake violations. It was necessary. He was almost shouting now. The investors, the construction contracts, the rezoning plans, everything was already in motion. We couldn't let a few stubborn farmers derail a multi-billion-dollar development project. Isabella's voice came through my earpiece. We've got everything. Corporate conspiracy, admission of falsified evidence, confirmation of the development plans. But Reynolds wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone, hands shaking slightly. Look at this. Tomorrow's press release. The technological integration announcement is just cover for the real plan. Once the media focuses on modernization, we start the forced acquisitions, environmental violations, safety code breaches, whatever it takes. The phone's screen showed detailed documents, press strategies, corporate communications, development timelines. Lucas's voice crackled in my ear. Got it. Remote capture complete. Every file he just accessed is copying to our servers. Who else knows about this? I asked, watching Reynolds' face carefully. Everyone at the top, the entire board, the development partners, the technology companies. It's all connected. The environmental fraud was just the beginning. We've got judges in our pocket, regulators looking the other way. He trailed off, suddenly seeming to realize how much he was revealing. Why are you telling me this? Reynolds slumped, the fight draining out of him. Because it's falling apart. The state investigation, the evidence leaks, the media attention. And the investors are getting nervous. Tomorrow's announcement was supposed to be our triumph. Instead, he straightened his tie with trembling fingers. I'm not going down alone. If they want to investigate environmental fraud, they're going to find a lot more than just falsified test results. Isabella's team was moving now, silently surrounding the property. Reynolds was too focused on his confession to notice. I have documentation, he continued. Records of every decision, every payoff, every cover-up. The environmental violations were just a small part of it. The water rights manipulation, the zoning board bribes, the offshore accounts. Mr. Reynolds, Isabella stepped out of the shadows, her badge gleaming. I think it's time we had a formal discussion about these records. The color drained from his face as he realized he'd been walking into a trap. More investigators emerged from the darkness, their positions revealing how completely he'd been surrounded. Everything you've said has been recorded, Isabella informed him. Every document you accessed on your phone has been captured. Right now, you have a choice. Continue this conversation at the station with your full cooperation, or wait for the warrants that will be issued based on your confessions here. Reynolds sagged, defeat written in every line of his body. I want immunity. That depends on what you give us. The full truth, Mr. Reynolds. Every detail, every name, every scheme. As they led him away, I stood on my porch watching the scene unfold. This was the moment everything changed, not through fights or legal battles, but through one man's realization that the house of cards was collapsing. Inside, the team was already processing the evidence. Lucas downloaded the captured phone data. Samantha organized the recorded confessions, and Isabella prepared initial reports for the prosecution team. This is it, Isabella said, looking up from her work. With Reynolds' testimony and the documentation he's offering, the entire operation comes down. Not just the environmental fraud, but the whole corrupt system they built. Tomorrow's technological integration announcement would still happen. The RDA would still try to push forward with their plans. But now we had something they didn't. Expect the truth, straight from one of their own, documented and undeniable. The night sky was starting to lighten, dawn approaching with the promise of a day that would change everything. Sometimes the critical moment isn't a dramatic confrontation or a legal victory. Sometimes it's just one person deciding they can't maintain the lies anymore. Reynolds' sedan sat in my driveway, a symbol of how quickly things can change. In a few hours, his confession would shatter the RDA's carefully constructed plans. But for now, in the quiet before dawn, I watched the security footage again, listening to the sound of justice finally catching up with those who thought they were above it. Officer Michael Stevens stood in front of the gathered law enforcement teams, his voice carrying across the makeshift command center we'd established in the county agricultural building. Maps and documents covered every available surface, each piece revealing another layer of the regional development authority's corruption. What we're looking at here goes beyond local jurisdiction, Stevens explained, pointing to a complex web of connections displayed on the main screen. The environmental fraud was just the tip of the iceberg. This operation spans multiple states, involves dozens of shell companies, and implicates officials at every level of government. Judge Olivia Parker sat in the front row, her expression grave as she reviewed warrant applications. The scope of corruption had grown so large that she'd been specially appointed to oversee the expanding investigation. "The evidence is overwhelming," she said, signing another stack of documents. "Wire fraud, environmental crimes, racketeering. Each new piece of evidence reveals more criminal activity." District Attorney Thomas Reed paced the room, his normally composed demeanor showing signs of strain. "We're not just dealing with corrupt officials anymore. These development plans were part of a nationwide scheme to seize agricultural land through fraudulent means. The environmental violations were just their latest tactic." Inspector Eleanor Green, who'd been analyzing financial records since dawn, looked up from her computer. "The money trail is staggering. Billions of dollars moving through offshore accounts. Kickbacks disguised as consulting fees, environmental remediation funds that never went to actual remediation. They turned agricultural land seizure into an industry." Stevens moved to another display, this one showing satellite imagery of targeted farming communities across the country. They refined their technique with each operation. Start with environmental violations, escalate to impossible fines, then swoop in with predatory buyout offers. But they got greedy here. They tried to take too much land too quickly. The command center buzzed with activity as new evidence continued to pour in. Federal agents coordinated with local law enforcement, forensic accountants dug through financial records, and environmental experts documented years of systematic fraud. "We've identified similar patterns in 12 other states," Reed announced, marking locations on a national map. Same playbook, same shell companies, same fraudulent environmental testing. They were building an empire by destroying farming communities. Judge Parker reviewed another warrant request. "The scope of this conspiracy is unprecedented. They didn't just break laws, they rewrote them to facilitate their scheme. The agricultural zoning changes, the water rights manipulations, the environmental regulation amendments. It was all orchestrated to enable their land grabs." A commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. Special Agent Sarah Martinez from the FBI's Environmental Crimes Division strode in, carrying new files. "We've got confirmation from the whistleblower network. Similar operations were being planned in 30 more communities. They were about to launch their biggest push yet." Stevens studied the new information, his jaw tightening. They were calling it the Agricultural Modernization Initiative, using environmental regulations as a weapon while presenting themselves as champions of progress. The perfect cover for massive land theft. The evidence wall grew as more connections emerged. Each document revealed new layers of corruption. Each testimony exposed more conspirators. What had started as an investigation into local environmental fraud had uncovered a national conspiracy. "The technical sophistication is remarkable," Eleanor noted, scrolling through data logs. They had satellite monitoring, soil testing protocols, water quality metrics, all calibrated to generate violations on demand. They could manufacture an environmental crisis whenever they needed one. Thomas Reed's phone buzzed with updates from other jurisdictions. "Similar investigations are now launching nationwide. The pattern is consistent. They target agricultural communities, manufacture environmental crises, then force land sales. But here's where they made their fatal mistake." He pulled up footage from my security cameras, showing Daniel Reynolds's midnight confession. They never expected resistance. Their previous operations succeeded because isolated farmers couldn't fight back effectively. But this community didn't break, and that changed everything. Judge Parker signed the final warrant of the morning session. "We're not just dismantling one corrupt organization. We're exposing a systematic assault on agricultural communities across the country. The ramifications of this case will reshape environmental law enforcement for years to come. The command center's atmosphere grew more intense as the full scope of the investigation became clear. This wasn't just about saving local farms anymore. This was about exposing a national conspiracy that had been destroying agricultural communities for years. Stevens gathered his team leads for an urgent briefing. We move on all locations simultaneously. Engineering firms that falsified environmental data, shell companies that handled illegal funds, government offices that facilitated the scheme. We hit everything at once. They've had years to perfect their operation. We can't give them time to hide evidence. Sarah Martinez coordinated with FBI teams across the country. Similar operations are being rolled out nationwide. The entire network is about to come down. But we need to move fast once they realize the extent of our investigation. Her warning was cut short by urgent messages flooding in. The regional development authorities' offices were being evacuated. Trucks were seen leaving their storage facilities. The conspirators were making their move. Execute all warrants now, Stevens commanded. Law enforcement teams mobilized, racing, to secure locations and evidence before it could be destroyed. The carefully planned operation shifted into emergency action. In the chaos that followed, I watched years of corruption begin to unravel. The elaborate scheme that had threatened farming communities across the country was finally exposed to the light of day. Inspector Green's computer pinged with alerts as digital evidence poured in. They're panicking, making mistakes. Every attempted cover-up is just creating more evidence of their crimes. Judge Parker prepared another round of emergency warrants. The truth doesn't disappear just because you try to hide it. Sometimes trying to bury evidence only makes it more visible. As the day progressed, the command center transformed into a hub of nationwide coordination. What had started with one farming community's resistance had sparked an investigation that would expose decades of systematic corruption. Stevens paused in his coordination efforts to address the room. Remember why we're here. This isn't just about prosecuting crimes. This is about protecting communities that feed our nation, about standing up to those who would destroy our agricultural heritage for profit. The bigger picture was finally clear. The environmental violations, the fraudulent tests, the forced sales, they were all part of a calculated assault on America's farming communities. But in trying to break our community, they had instead exposed their entire operation. Sarah Martinez summed it up perfectly. They thought they could hide their crimes behind environmental regulations and legal complexity. Instead, they created a paper trail that will bring down their entire network. Sometimes, the biggest conspiracies fall apart because they never expect anyone to stand up to them. Rebecca Taylor wasn't your typical investigative journalist. She'd grown up on a small farm herself, and something about the regional development authorities' sudden interest in agricultural modernization had struck her as suspicious from the start. Now, sitting in her cramped office at the State Chronicle, she stared at her computer screen with a mix of shock and vindication. "This goes so much deeper than we thought," she muttered, scrolling through thousands of documents, email threads, financial records, internal memos, each one revealing another layer of the conspiracy. Her desk was buried under stacks of evidence, all pointing to a massive scheme that had been operating in plain sight for years. Attorney Christopher Adams stood by the window, reviewing legal documents with growing concern. "They didn't just break environmental laws," he said. "They rewrote them to facilitate their land grabs. Every agricultural regulation passed in the last 5 years had their fingerprints on it." Investigator Nicholas Brown spread out surveillance photos across Rebecca's desk. "Look at the pattern. Every community they targeted followed the same, a sequence. Environmental violations, escalating fines, forced sales, they perfected their technique through repetition." The newsroom buzzed with unusual energy. Other reporters gathered around as Rebecca began laying out the story. This wasn't just another corruption exposé. This was the revelation of a systematic assault on farming communities across the nation. Whistleblower Sophia Parker, a former RDA environmental analyst, sat quietly in the corner, her hands trembling slightly as she reviewed her old reports. "I tried to warn people," she said softly. "Every time I questioned their data, every time I pointed out inconsistencies in the testing, they just moved me to different projects." Rebecca's editor paced behind her desk, running his hands through his hair. "We need to be absolutely certain about every detail. When this story breaks, they're going to come at us with everything they've got. Legal threats, smear campaigns, the works." "The evidence is solid," Christopher assured him. "Every document verified, every source confirmed. They can threaten all they want. The truth is impossible to contain at this point." Nicholas tapped one of the surveillance photos. Their own security cameras documented their crimes. Board meetings where they openly discussed fabricating violations, internal presentations about their real development plans. They were so confident in their power that they didn't bother hiding their intentions. Rebecca finished typing with a flourish. The headline on her screen read, "Exposed, the corporate conspiracy to seize America's farmland through environmental fraud." The subheading was equally damning. Regional Development Authorities Modernization. Program revealed as massive land grab scheme. As the story went through final edits, more evidence poured in from across the country. Other newspapers began contacting Rebecca, sharing similar stories from their communities. What had started as a local investigation was becoming a national revelation. Sophia leaned forward, pointing to specific passages in the article. "Make sure you emphasize the environmental impact. They didn't just falsify violations, they actively damaged the land they seized. Their modern farming methods destroyed soil health, depleted water resources, and eliminated biodiversity." Christopher's phone buzzed constantly with updates from legal teams across the country. Class action lawsuits are being filed in 12 states. Environmental groups are joining forces with farming communities. The dam is breaking. The story went live at midnight. Rebecca sat at her desk, watching as it spread across social media, got picked up by national news outlets, and triggered reactions from officials across the country. The truth was finally emerging, and it was more devastating than anyone had imagined. By dawn, the RDA's offices were surrounded by protesters. Farmers, environmental activists, and community members gathered to demand accountability. News helicopters circled overhead, capturing the scene as law enforcement served warrants and seized records. Nicholas arrived with fresh surveillance photos. "They're trying to destroy evidence, but it's too late. We have copies of everything. Their own security systems documented their panic." Sophia watched the coverage with tears in her eyes. All those years of keeping quiet, of feeling helpless. "I never thought I'd see them exposed like this." Rebecca's phone rang constantly. More whistleblowers coming forward, other journalists seeking collaboration, affected farmers sharing their stories. The truth wasn't just emerging, it was avalanching. Christopher reviewed emergency injunctions being filed across the country. Courts are freezing their assets, halting their operations. The very legal system they manipulated is now being used to dismantle their empire. The RDA's carefully constructed facade crumbled in real time. Their press releases about agricultural modernization were drowned out by evidence of their true intentions. Every attempt to deny the allegations was met with their own documented admissions of guilt. Rebecca started a new article, this one focusing on the human cost of the RDA's schemes. Stories of farmers who'd lost everything, communities destroyed by fraudulent environmental claims, generations of agricultural heritage nearly wiped out by corporate greed. Nicholas compiled a timeline of the RDA's operations. They'd been doing this for 15 years. Each success made them bolder. Each community they destroyed made them more confident, until they finally targeted a community that fought back. As morning turned to afternoon, the story continued to grow. Environmental scientists came forward to expose how the RDA had corrupted their findings. Former employees revealed internal practices designed to generate violations on demand. Government officials admitted to being pressured into supporting the scheme. Sophia organized her years of documented concerns into a devastating testimony. They created an elaborate fiction about environmental protection while actively working to destroy sustainable farming practices. The real environmental criminals weren't the farmers. They were the corporate interests trying to steal their land. The truth emerged not as a single revelation, but as a cascade of evidence, each piece adding to the picture of corruption and greed. What had started with one community's resistance had exposed a nationwide conspiracy to destroy agricultural communities for corporate profit. Rebecca sat back, watching the impact of the story ripple across the country. Sometimes the truth doesn't need embellishment or dramatic presentation. Sometimes it just needs to be unveiled, allowing its own weight to bring down those who thought they could bury it forever. Justice arrived on a crisp autumn morning, carried by a convoy of federal vehicles winding their way up to the Regional Development Authority's headquarters. Andrew Watson, the lead federal prosecutor, emerged from the first vehicle, warrant folders tucked under his arm. The morning sun caught the gold badge on his lapel as he ascended the steps, flanked by federal agents. Inside, Megan Davis from the Environmental Protection Agency's Criminal Investigation Division directed teams of investigators through the building. Years of fraudulent environmental data were being boxed up as evidence, each document telling another part of the story of corruption and greed. William Turner, the state's Attorney General, stood in what had once been Nathan Hughes's office, watching as investigators dismantled the empire of lies piece by piece. "It's remarkable," he mused, picking up a framed environmental award from the desk. They built their entire operation on the pretense of protecting the environment while actively working to destroy sustainable farming practices. The investigation had expanded far beyond our small farming community. Caroline Miller, the federal environmental crimes prosecutor, had uncovered similar operations in states across the country. The RDA's model of using environmental regulations as weapons against farmers had spread like a virus, infecting agricultural communities nationwide. The scope of their deception was unprecedented, Caroline explained, reviewing case files in the converted war room. They didn't just falsify environmental data, they created an entire parallel reality where traditional farming was the enemy and corporate takeover was the only solution. Jonathan Pierce, leading the forensic accounting team, had traced billions of dollars through a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts. Every environmental violation generated profit, he reported. Fines, forced sales, development contracts. They turned agricultural destruction into a business model. The morning news carried live coverage of the arrests. Nathan Hughes, being led out in handcuffs, his corporate armor finally cracked. Rachel Bennett, looking small without her clipboard and manufactured authority. One by one, the architects of the scheme faced justice. But the real victory wasn't in the arrests or the headlines. It came in the quieter moments that followed. The emergency session of the state legislature where William Turner presented evidence of corrupted environmental regulations. The unanimous vote to restore agricultural protections. The establishment of new oversight committees staffed by actual farmers and legitimate environmental scientists. Megan Davis oversaw the dismantling of the RDA's fraudulent testing protocols. They had twisted environmental science into a weapon, she said, examining their falsified data. Now we're returning it to its true purpose, protecting both the land and those who work it. The farmers' market reopened that weekend, its stalls filled with produce from lands that had nearly been stolen through corporate deception. Maria Garcia's organic certification was restored, her tomatoes once again drawing crowds. Old Mr. Harrison's honey stand was back, his bees still pollinating fields that developers had planned to pave over. Jonathan Pierce's final audit revealed the true cost of the RDA's scheme. Millions in fraudulent fines, billions in threatened property values, countless lives disrupted by manufactured environmental crises. But it also showed something else: the resilience of farming communities that refused to be broken. Caroline Miller prosecuted the cases with methodical precision. One by one, the conspirators faced justice. Some took plea deals, turning on their former colleagues. Others fought the charges, only to be confronted with their own documented crimes. The truth, once exposed, proved impossible to deny. The reformation of agricultural oversight brought real environmental experts like Andrew Watson to the forefront. "We're implementing true environmental protection," he explained at a community meeting, "working with farmers, not against them, supporting sustainable practices instead of punishing them." William Turner's office established a task force to review every environmental regulation passed during the RDA's reign. "We're not just undoing their damage," he declared. "We're building new protections to ensure this can never happen again." The autumn harvest came, and with it, a sense of renewal. Fields that had been threatened by corporate greed now yielded their bounty under the care of farmers who had fought to protect them. The land, resilient as ever, continued its ancient cycle of growth and abundance. Standing in my fields, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and purple, I thought about the battle we had won. Not just for our farms, but for the principle that truth, when defended by a determined community, can overcome even the most elaborate schemes of corruption. The evening breeze carried the scent of fresh earth and growing things. Somewhere in the distance, a tractor hummed as another farmer worked their land in peace, free from the shadow of manufactured violations and corporate threats. This story isn't just about exposing corruption or defeating a powerful enemy. It's about the strength found in community, the power of standing together against injustice, and the enduring value of protecting our agricultural heritage. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of honest work on land that remained free. The Regional Development Authority had tried to bury the truth under mountains of fraudulent documents and false violations. Instead, they had only proven that some things, like justice, community, and the connection between farmers and their land, can never be destroyed by corporate greed. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.